This Airbus A330 is on final approach, but something is seriously wrong.
Too low.
In the cockpit, the pilots are fighting for their lives to try and slow the careening aircraft down, and what has caused this situation is stranger than you would ever believe. Stay tuned. Accidents happen for a variety of reasons, but in almost every case the root cause can be traced back to something very benign. Maybe a small mistake that someone makes, sometimes weeks or even months before the accident. That initial mistake is then always followed by several others, allowing established safety barriers to be crossed in what we now know as Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model. This is why, to be able to fully understand any accident or incident, we have to go back to the very first thing that put the ball in motion. In this story, that means going back to 2001, to the planning of an extension to the apron on Juanda, Surabaya airport in Indonesia. The original plan was for 10 aircraft stands, which are basically parking spaces for aircraft, to be built next to the existing stands on the airport. But to start with, only stands 5 to 10 had actually been completed. The remaining 4 stands were to be constructed at a later stage, so that last bit of land next to the apron was left unpaved, until a need to expand would eventually arise. Meanwhile, stand 5 to 10 were fitted with what's known as fuel hydrants, basically a grid of underground fuel pipes leading up to each stand. This system enables the aircraft fuelers to just hook up a pump car to the hydrant and then start pumping fuel directly from a centralized tank, instead of having to haul the fuel around in huge fuel trucks. This is very common in larger airports, especially at stands where larger, long-haul aircraft are to be refueled, since they generally need enormous amounts of fuel. Now, the pump trucks, which are used to complete refueling, fill several important functions. Obviously, they provide the pressure needed to suck the fuel from the hydrant and then push it into the aircraft, but they also incorporate a couple of fuel filters, which acts as the last barrier to fuel contamination before the fuel enters into the aircraft tanks. The fuel is pumped through these filters, and the pressure differential between the intake of the filter and the output must be closely monitored, since any increase in that differential pressure might indicate some type of fuel contamination from the system. So, what type of fuel contaminations can exist then? Well, there is obviously a large variety, but the most common one is water, which can enter into the system in various different ways. Either as free water from condensation inside the tanks or an outside source, or as water solved in the fuel itself, which can break out as free water when the temperature of the fuel changes. If there is water contamination, this can then lead to further microbiological contamination in the fuel, like fungi or algae, kind of like the inside of a dirty swimming pool. On top of that, there can of course also be other forms of dirt, pieces of rust from piping and other small contaminants, so these filters are super important. But how will a filter be able to catch water, you might ask? Well, that's a great question, and it will introduce you to one of the big villains in this episode, called super absorbent polymers, or SAP for short. Part of the filters inside of the pump trucks has a layer filled with these little polymers, and their job is to attract any water content in the fuel and then absorb it. When that happens, the SAP powder turns into a type of gel, and it effectively stops the fuel from continuing to run through the filter, increasing the differential pressure a lot and therefore giving a clear indication that the fuel is contaminated. This, by the way, is the same type of polymers that you can find in some variants of diapers. Anyway, about a month before the accident flight, Cathay flight 780 was scheduled to depart, the work to complete those remaining 4 stands had finally started. The weather was miserable during the period, with rain almost every day, and before the concrete could be laid on the new apron, the piping for the new fuel hydrants needed to be completed. This included some quite elaborate welding work, and great care was taken when placing the new tubes out and then connecting them to the already existing piping for nearby stands 5 to 10. Now, the Surabaya airport is situated quite close to the sea, and the closest regulating pool, constructed to control the water levels around the airport, was only 300 meters away from the work site, and it was mainly containing seawater. As the work continued in the pouring rain, pools of salt water therefore started to build up inside of the work area. All of the stands with hydrants connected to the work area had of course been turned off and sealed as the work was going on, and before they and the new hydrants could be reconnected, the fuel company, Pertamina, who was in charge of all of the fueling on the airport, had to flush the whole system clean using fuel. After that flushing was then completed, the Indonesian Civil Aviation Authorities, DGCA, had to come in and inspect and finally approve the installation before it was allowed to be used again. Now, the flushing of the system was eventually done on the 9th of April to the best of Pertamina's ability, but without any real guidance for how to do it and how much fuel they had to use. After the flushing, the Pertamina crew who had been conducting the work assumed that since the circuit from stand 1 to 10 had now been opened and flushed, it could safely be used again, even though the final inspection had not been completed. And it looks like at some point during the construction and piping work, some salt water must have entered into the system and it had not been properly flushed out before the hydrants were connected again. This brings us to the 12th of April 2010, which was the day before the accident flight. On this day, another aircraft from Cathay Pacific was operating out of Surabaya and had uplifted fuel from the hydrant at stand number 6. After departure and during the cruise phase towards their destination, the pilots of this flight noticed some fluctuations on their engine parameters, specifically on engine number 1, but they didn't receive any associated warnings and the engine seemed to be continuing to work well. They continued to their destination and reported these fluctuations to the maintenance engineers, and the engineers had a look at it and they decided to change the fuel metering unit, which is the unit that effectively controls the fuel input into the engine. After the FMU was replaced, the engine worked fine, so no further tests were conducted and no one connected this issue with the fuel uplift in Surabaya airport. The following day, on the 13th of April, a crew consisting of 2 pilots and 11 cabin crew were scheduled to operate Cathay Pacific Flight 780 from Surabaya to Hong Kong. They had arrived from Hong Kong the previous night on the same aircraft and had now enjoyed a nice night stop before they were supposed to return back to their base again. The homebound flight was scheduled at 8:20 local time, so the crew arrived to the airport and started a pre-flight briefing about an hour before that at 7:20. The captain of the flight was reasonably young, only 35 years old, but had already amassed over 7,700 hours of total time, and 2,600 of those had been flown on the aircraft they were now going to operate, the Airbus A330. He was joined by a 37-year-old first officer who was also reasonably experienced with just over 4,000 hours of total time and 1,171 of those flown on the 330. He had only been working for 3 years for Cathay at that time, and before that he had flown 11 years in the Royal Australian Air Force. The 2 pilots started their pre-flight briefing by checking through the logbook, which they were already quite familiar with since they had operated the same aircraft on the day before. The aircraft was a 12-year-old Airbus A330-342 with 2 giant Trent 700 turbofan engines fitted to it. It had no technical faults recorded in the logbook and had worked perfectly on the previous day, so they were quite confident with it. They then proceeded to check the weather and NOTAMs for the 6-hour-long flight they had ahead of them, and everything looked reasonably well, with only a few thunderstorms around the route and possibly a bit of crosswind in Hong Kong later on, but everything was well within their comfort zone. They decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for the flight, and then the captain walked over to the cabin crew and proceeded to brief them about the flight. The cabin crew, they were also really experienced. They were led by an in-flight service manager who was supported by 1 senior purser, 3 junior pursers and 6 junior cabin crew. Since there was nothing special expected during the flight, the briefing was concluded relatively quickly and they then proceeded out to the aircraft, which was now being made ready for refueling at stand number 8. The pilots had decided to uplift 24,400 kilos for a total departure fuel of 33,400. And when the captain started his walk around, he saw that the fueler was doing a fuel quality check, so he walked over to have a look at it for himself. A fuel quality check is made by taking a fuel sample downstream of the pump car's fuel filter and then visually verify that it's clear and doesn't contain any visible contaminants or free water. The fuel sample that was taken looked great, so the captain happily continued his walk around as the fueler started uplifting the fuel. But just a few minutes into the fueling, the fueler noticed that the fuel hose seemed to be vibrating more than normal. He knew about the recent reconnection of the underground fuel system, so he assumed that there might be air bubbles in there causing the vibration, just like in your kitchen faucet when the water has been turned off for a while. He stopped the fueling for a few seconds and then resumed, which momentarily solved the vibrations, but he had to do so several times before all of the fuel was uplifted. Also, strangely, when he later checked the diff pressure around the fuel filter, he noticed that it had risen a bit. Now, he noted that down in the pump truck's logbook and thought maybe it's time to change the fuel filter soon, and then he continued his duties. Now, what had actually happened here was that the remaining salt water, which had been left inside of the piping, had now gone into the filter, where the sap particles had caught it just as they were designed to do. But what was not designed was the fact that this was salt water, not normal water, and the salt particles attached to the sap particles, causing the filter to not block up completely as it was designed. Instead, the filter had continued to let fuel pass through, but the pressure inside had caused the filter to deform and for the fuel to start backflowing through the filter and bypass it through the hose and then into the aircraft. That was likely the cause for those vibrations that the fueler had felt during the fueling. Now, this wasn't great, but it still wasn't supposed to be a huge deal. Aircraft engines are certified to be able to run with quite significant amounts of fuel contamination, so one broken filter should normally not have been such a big problem. But what no one knew was that the now broken filter had started to produce a completely new type of contaminants, which no one had calculated with, and this was the sap particles themselves. The fuel filters inside of the aircraft engines are graded to be able to catch all particles down to a size of around 40 micrometers and to catch around 90% of all particles between 10 and 40. But that meant that inside of the fuel that was now being uplifted was a contaminant that was to a large part smaller than even the engine filters were able to remove. This will end up having some severe consequences, and I'll tell you all about those after this. If you've been following my channels for a while, you already know that I'm a huge advocate for personal growth and mental well-being. Whether that is overcoming your fear of flying or dealing with everyday challenges, I really think that therapy can make a significant difference if it's done right. And that's why I am so happy to introduce you to today's sponsor, BetterHelp, a company dedicated to making therapy more accessible through the help of technology. With BetterHelp, you can bypass the hassle of having to commute to an office somewhere and sitting in an awkward waiting room. Instead, you can get your therapy from the comfort of your own home. You start by filling out a quick questionnaire, then BetterHelp will match you with a therapist from their extensive network of licensed professionals. After that, you can be in contact with your therapist as soon as in 48 hours. It's really quick. And if you for whatever reason would feel that your therapist is not a great fit for you, well, then you can switch to another one without having to pay anything extra. You'll be able to reach your therapist through video calls, your phone, or even text messages, making access super easy and quick when you really need it. Now, to try this out for yourself, go to betterhelp.com/mentorpilot. That will give you a 10% discount on your first month of therapy to try it out. Thank you, BetterHelp. Now back to the video. As the captain was still outside doing his walk around, the cabin crew welcomed the 309 passengers on board and guided them to their seats. The first officer was preparing the cockpit, and when the captain came back, he started briefing him about the expected departure route, and then they completed the before start checklist. The gate agent came in with a fuel receipt, and the whole operation was flowing really smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that they were fully ready for departure 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So at time 8:11, they received their pushback and startup clearance and started moving away from their stand. The weather for departure was super nice, with only some scattered clouds around, very light winds, and a temperature of 28 degrees centigrade. Perfect weather for flying. The aircraft taxied out to the holding position for runway 28 whilst the pilots completed the last pre-flight checks. And at time 8:24, the Airbus started accelerating down the runway for takeoff. The takeoff and initial climb out was completely uneventful, with the first officer hand-flying the aircraft to just over 1100 feet and then engaging the autopilot. At this point, everything looked like it was going to be a nice routine flight back to Hong Kong. But deep within the Airbus's fuel system, the sap spheres were now sloshing around in the tanks, getting closer and closer to the pumps who were sucking fuel into the engines. The fuel system of the Airbus A330 comprises of several inner and outer wing tanks, and then a separate fuel tank in the horizontal stabilizer. In the wing tanks, collector cells are situated near the wing roots, and from there the two main pumps sucks fuel in and delivers it to the engines. There's also a standby pump outside of the collector cell if it should be needed. After the fuel has been sucked from those tanks, it is then pumped via a heat exchanger used to cool the engine oil, and then via the engine low pressure filter to the high pressure pump, which creates enough pressure to run the subsequent fuel metering units, or FMU. The FMU then provides the correct amount of fuel to the engine burners. Now, obviously there are about 1 million more separate components to the system, but that should give you a general idea of how it looks. Each engine is controlled by a separate electronic engine control unit, or EEC, which is basically a small computer that senses thrust lever and auto thrust input and then translates that into commands for the FMU, depending on things like outside conditions, engine performance and many more things. Inside the FMU there are several mechanical valves that are designed to keep the fuel pressure constant and to act immediately and with great precision to the EEC demands. Now, I know we're getting quite far into system designs now, but all of these things are important to fully understand what's about to happen. Before I stop talking technical stuff, there's only one more system I want to mention, and that is a system inside the engine known as the engine airflow control. You see, when air moves through a jet engine's core, it will flow past first the low, then intermediate and finally high pressure compressors before entering into the burn chambers. This flow normally works perfectly at higher rotation speeds, but when the engine is forced to suddenly change speed or run at lower RPMs, there can be sudden changes in the pressure, which can cause what's known as engine surges or stalls, if it's not properly controlled. Engine surges are basically compressor blades stalling, causing air to flow the wrong way inside of the engine, and that's not great since it can cause damage to the engine and severely affect its performance. Now, to make sure that that doesn't happen, several variable stator vanes and bleed valves have been built into the engine compressor stages to make sure that the pressure can be accurately controlled. Since I mentioned before that these pressure changes are directly caused by changes in engine speed, these valves and vanes are actuated with the help of something known as fuel hydraulic, which is basically fuel pressure from the high pressure fuel pump. And that means that this system is directly connected to the function of the fuel system. As the aircraft was now climbing out on its way up towards the northeast, the pilots started noticing some quite abnormal engine pressure ratio fluctuations on engine number 2. It fluctuated around 0.015 EPR, and when they looked at engine number 1, it was also fluctuating, but not as much. This was a bit strange, but there were no warnings associated with it, and the engines were running fine, so the pilots just discussed it and decided to continue the flight, and to tell the engineers about it when they arrived to their destination. But about 33 minutes into the flight, just after they had leveled off at their cruise altitude of 39,000 feet, a warning suddenly appeared on the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. The warning stated Engine 2 control system fault, and with the sub-information Engine 2 slow response. But it didn't have any checklist action items for the pilots to do, it was just for their information. The captain immediately got into contact with Cathay maintenance control via satellite phone in order to get some help interpreting and possibly troubleshooting the issue. The engineer who took the call asked the pilots to check how the engine responded to thrust lever movements. And when the pilots tried to do that, they could see that the engine did respond, but that the EPR was still fluctuating a bit around the target. The engineer and captain then continued to look through their manuals to see what could possibly be causing this without finding anything specific. They also discussed the possibility of changing the engine control from EPR to N1 instead, but decided against it since the engine control seemed to be working fine, it was just fluctuating a bit. The engineers in the control center were able to monitor the engine parameters remotely via data link, and from what they could see, the engines were performing well. So they advised the crew to continue to monitor the situation and call again if something else would come up. Based on the information they had at that point, the pilots just discussed the information but agreed that they were happy to continue the flight. Of course, what they didn't know was that the SAP spheres inside of their fuel had now started to concentrate inside of the wing collector tanks, and more of them were being sucked into the engine fuel system. Once they were in there, they seeped through the engine filters and started depositing themselves around linkages and valves within the fuel metering units and other crucial parts of the system. So what the pilots were seeing on their engine instruments was actually the result of those valves having a harder and harder time to move because of the contamination. Now, this didn't really manifest itself as a huge problem as long as the engine speed was held more or less constant, and there was very minimal movement of those valves needed, but that would of course not last for very long. 1 hour and 15 minutes after the first warning, the pilots were asked to descend from flight level 390 to 380 as they entered into the Malaysian Kota Kinabalu airspace. And as soon as the aircraft leveled off at the new level, the Engine 2 control system fault ECAM warning reappeared. This time, it was accompanied by both the information "Avoid rapid thrust changes" and Engine 2 slow response. The pilots acknowledged the info, but again there was no real items for them to complete. They tried to switch on and off the engine anti-ice to see if that would have any effect on the EPR fluctuations, but nothing really happened. The engine still was working fine and responding to thrust level demands. Now, again, there were no information in the manuals about what the underlying conditions for these warnings actually were. But we know that the "Avoid rapid thrust changes" warning indicates a problem with the engine airflow control. Remember, that's the part of the system with the variable inlet guide vanes and bleed valves. And the other warning had to do with the fuel metering unit. So here we can already see how the SAP spheres had started to affect more and more components inside of the number 2 engine fuel system. And of course, what's inside engine number 2 would eventually also reach engine number 1. The captain now called up the maintenance control again with quite a bit more concern this time and asked them if they could see what they were seeing and if it was really safe to continue the flight. This time there was another engineer who took the call, who had been briefed by the situation by one of his colleagues. He looked at the data again and confirmed that from their standpoint there was nothing alarming going on. They had checked and there had been no maintenance action taking place overnight, which could explain a sudden misbehaving engine, and the other parameters looked similar to the first time that they had called up. The engineer then had a look at the number 1 engine and considered that that one was working well without any real issues. Yeah, there were some minor EPR fluctuations on that side as well, but he thought that that might be due to the engine trying to compensate for the fluctuations on the opposite side. This, by the way, whilst being a plausible theory, is not really how these engines actually work. They work by trying to keep the aircraft speed as close as possible to the required speed, but not by compensating the exact thrust output. But he also said that the message "Avoid rapid thrust changes" was related to the variable guide vane system, and that the crew should move the thrust levels carefully to try to avoid any exceedances. If an exceedance would happen anyway, they should just follow the procedures in their manuals, and in any case, the FMU was going to be replaced when they reached Hong Kong to sort this issue out. This explanation sounded good to the pilots, who now felt more happy again to continue the flight. Now, before anyone starts to have any opinions regarding their decision making here, remember that these 2 pilots had no idea about all of the other things that I've already told you regarding the fuel contamination. And the Airbus warning system had not been programmed to connect the dots with this either. In the pilot's eyes, they had had some minor fluctuations on mainly one engine, which had caused 2 different warnings, which didn't have any action items connected to them, and all of this was being monitored by their maintenance control remotely, and they had deemed it safe. Now, I would have likely taken exactly the same decision as these 2 pilots did if I was in their shoes, and that's also what the final report ultimately said. The flight continued without any further issues, and about 1 hour and a half later, at the time 12:55 Hong Kong time, the aircraft entered into the Hong Kong FIR and started coming into range for the arrival 80s. The captain copied the 80s via their ACAR system, and it indicated that runway 07 left was in use with the wind coming from 160 degrees at 9 knots, but it was varying between 100 and 160 degrees, meaning that it could be both tail and headwind for the landing. The visibility was more than 10 kilometers, with few clouds at 600 feet and scattered clouds at 1800 feet, temperature 29 degrees, dew point 24, and a QNH pressure setting of 1013 hectopascals. But there was also a SPECI report added to the 80s, advising of significant wind shear forecasted for both runways due to the varying winds. Now, except for the wind shear warning, this was quite good weather, and the first officer started preparing for an ILS approach into runway 07 left. He planned for a flaps full landing, and after having checked the landing performance, the pilots both agreed to use the low autobrake setting, as the runway was very nice and long. After the briefing, they were handed over to Hong Kong Radar, who cleared them to follow the Subno 2 Alpha standard arrival route just as they had briefed. And before they started the descent, the captain made a normal PA to the passengers. They were then cleared to initially descend to flight level 230, and this is where things really started to get interesting. At time 13:19, as they were descending, the pilots heard a light popping sound, followed by a smell in the cockpit of ozone and something burning. This was then almost immediately followed by an ECAM warning saying engine number 1 control system fault and engine 2 stall. This was not good news. The captain started actioning the ECAM actions associated with the engine stall, which included reducing the thrust back to idle on engine number 2. This effectively meant that they now only had engine number 1 available to them, which was now starting to show the exact same ECAM warnings that engine number 2 had previously shown. This was including engine number 1 slow response and avoid rapid thrust changes. The SAP spheres had now also reached the inner part of that engine. The captain moved the number 1 thrust lever forward into the max continuous thrust detent in accordance with the single engine procedures, but the engine responded only by increasing the thrust up to about 57% N1 before dropping back again to 37%, which was close to idle. The pilots now knew that they were dealing with something far more serious than they had previously thought. The captain pushed the transmit button on his radio and called, "Hong Kong Cathay 780, pan 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 pan. We're operating engine 2 on idle thrust but otherwise normal procedures. We would like to request an elevated response level." A PAN call is an urgency call, which means that an aircraft is dealing with something unusual and might require priority, but that there is no immediate risk to the lives of the people on board or the safety of the aircraft. The air traffic controller acknowledged the PAN call and decided to notify the airport's fire and rescue services to make them ready in a state known as local standby. This would have them deployed and ready if something would happen after landing. Since the pilots realized that they were now going to effectively have to fly the approach on only one engine, the procedure stipulated that the captain should fly the approach. So the captain rebriefed the approach according to the single engine profile, meaning flaps 3 instead of flaps full, and made sure that everything else was correctly programmed into the flight management computer. He then asked air traffic control if they could get priority, which was immediately approved, and then they were cleared towards a waypoint called Limes, which forms part of the transition into the ILS for runway 07 left. They started turning towards that waypoint, but before he took over controls, the captain also contacted the in-flight service manager and explained the situation to her. He asked her to please start preparing the cabin for landing and to have a look out on the right-hand side engine to see if she could see something unusual and report back if she did. The service manager read this back and then hung up the handset, and as she was started to walk down back through the aircraft, the captain made a PA to the cabin crew to start preparing for landing. So far, this was handled in an excellent manner by the whole crew, with all parties involved, informed and participating. It was really nice to see. The aircraft was now given continuous descent clearances, and with the captain now in control, things were about to take a further turn for the worse. At time 13:30, when they were about 45 miles away from the runway, the aircraft needed to momentarily level off at 8,000 feet. This meant that the captain had to add thrust on engine number 1, but when he did so, the ECAM message "engine 1 stall" appeared. And that meant that their only remaining engine was now starting to have some real problems. The pilots completed the ECAM actions, which included reducing the thrust to idle on that engine as well, meaning that now both engines were in idle. And when the captain tried the engines by disconnecting the outer throttle and moving one of the thrust levers forward slowly, one at a time, there was no response from either of them. Instead, the ECAM message "engine 1 stall" just came back again. This was really bad. The aircraft was at 8,000 feet with a speed of around 295 knots at this point, with 45 nautical miles to go. A general rule is that an aircraft will glide about 3 times its height in nautical miles, plus maybe 1 mile per 10 knots above its stall speed. So that would mean 8 times 3, 24, plus maybe another 12 if they were lucky. That's around 36 miles, which was clearly not enough. With that in mind, the crew now elected to make a mayday call, notifying air traffic control that they were experiencing a double engine stall situation. They were immediately cleared to descend to 3,000 feet, but could not yet start to turn visually for the airport as they were still inside clouds at this point. Knowing that the flight directors were giving him instructions based on the assumption that both engines were still working, the captain now asked for the flight directors to be turned off, and he also disconnected the autopilot and started flying the aircraft completely manually. Now, the reasoning behind taking away the automatics at this point will be left up to the captain to explain, but sometimes when you're dealing with an aircraft that is not behaving as it should, flying it manually might give a better overall technical situation awareness and a better feel for the aircraft. In any case, the first thing he did after disconnecting was to pitch up slightly and start climbing, which had the double effect of gaining him some altitude, which is glide distance, and reducing the speed back towards the green dot speed, which is the best speed for single engine operation, in this case around 202 knots. Both of these factors would help the aircraft reach as far as possible if they couldn't get at least one of the engines back working for them. Whilst the captain was doing this, the first officer started the auxiliary power unit, the APU, and he switched both engine start selectors to ignite. This would provide continuous starter ignition inside the engines to counteract any potential flameout. The aircraft now finally broke through the clouds, meaning that the pilots could actually see the airport. The captain tried to slowly move the thrust levers up from the idle position one at a time again, but initially there was still no response from any of them. But after a few tries, engine number 1 finally responded and started increasing to an N1 around 74%, with the thrust levers in the climb detent. This was of course a little bit less than it should be giving with the thrust lever in that position, but it was more than enough to keep the aircraft flying and even accelerating a bit. Engine number 2 never responded and remained at an N1 of 17%, which is less than idle, meaning that it had essentially failed. At time 13:36, the first officer gave the cabin crew seats for landing over the PA, and a few seconds later he also added cabin crew to stations, which meant that the cabin crew should now start getting ready for a possible evacuation after landing. The cabin crew immediately reacted and called up the cockpit and advised them that they were now fully ready for landing. The captain was now visually maneuvering towards the runway, and the tower advised him that he was cleared for a visual approach and that he could choose between runway 07 left or right, whichever he preferred. As this was going on, there were several more ECAM messages displayed, which kept displaying over the next few minutes, none of them relevant to the engine problems that they were facing, so they were quickly disregarded. Instead, the first officer asked the captain if he should try to action the QRH action items for an all-engine flameout fuel remaining on engine number 2 to see if that could maybe get it back up running. The captain agreed to try, so the first officer deployed the ram air turbine, the RAT, he selected the APU bleed air switch to on and cycled the number 2 master switch to off and then on again, but to no avail, the engine remained below idle. Now, using that checklist did not form part of any stipulated procedure for this particular situation that they found themselves in, but it certainly made sense and could have, if the fault was of a different nature, solved the problem. This type of thinking outside of the box actions are all hallmarks of great technical knowledge and airmanship under a very stressful condition. After that, the captain now wanted to start preparing the aircraft for landing, so at time 13:42 he asked for flaps config 1 to be selected. The aircraft was at this point at 5,600 feet with a speed of 219 knots, about 9 miles away from the airport. That's pretty high, but very understandable given that the captain knew that he could lose the remaining engine at any point and he wanted to have the option to continue to glide in. But he now wanted to start decelerating, so he moved the number 1 thrust lever back to idle detent, but here came the next problem. The engine did not respond. Instead, it continued to deliver around 74% of thrust, meaning that from the altitude that the aircraft now was, and with that kind of thrust, they were way too high and had way too much energy to complete the stabilized approach. But the captain knew that he had no choice. There was no telling how long he would have that remaining engine working, so he just had to get this aircraft down. He decided to continue flying through the extended scent line to give himself some more track miles and then re-establish on the final from the north instead. At the same time, the captain also took up the PA mic and made a short PA to the passengers, telling them that they were experiencing some problems with their engines, which was causing the vibrations that they could all feel, and he also told them to remain seated and listen carefully to the commands of the cabin crew. Now, he could have let the first officer make this PA, but the truth is that during actual emergencies, it's important for both the passengers and the crew to hear the captain's voice and for him to reaffirm the authority of the cabin crew. Again, a really stellar performance. As the aircraft re-established itself on the center line, it was still at 5,200 feet, 8 nautical miles away from touchdown, and now with a speed of 234 knots, which was just way too high. The captain extended the speed brakes and the landing gear to try and increase the drag as he pitched the nose down towards the runway, and this helped a little bit, but not enough to keep the speed below the maximum speed for flaps 1, which was 240 knots. This caused an overspeed warning to start sounding in the cockpit, and this happened at the same time as the pilots were going through the landing checklist. Hong Kong Tower now cleared the aircraft to land runway 07 left and gave them the surface wind of 150 degrees at 13 knots, meaning a moderate crosswind from the right. Engine number 1 was still producing around 70% of thrust, making the deceleration impossible for the crew as they continued to blast down towards the runway with a speed around 100 knots faster than they should normally have. The captain stowed the speed brake and armed it for landing instead, so that they would get the help of the automatic ground spoilers after touchdown. As the aircraft passed 732 feet, the speed was still 227 knots, with flaps 1 selected, and this high speed caused a much higher than normal vertical speed, which in turn now triggered the ground proximity warning system.
Too low, terrain. Pull up!
Could now be heard together with a second overspeed warning. The cockpit environment was now super stressful, but it didn't seem to affect the two pilots too much. They were still calmly discussing different options they had, like if they should try to extend flaps 2 or not. The captain said that the flaps would likely not come out due to the high speed, but the first officer suggested that they should at least try it anyway. Flaps 2 was selected, and almost immediately they received a flashing F relief warning, indicating that the flaps was not extending to the full flaps 2 position, but instead to an intermediate position to protect the flap mechanism from the high aerodynamic loads at that speed. Anyway, there was not much more that the pilots could do at this point. They just had to get this aircraft down, so the captain just continued pressing on. The GPWS kept blaring "too low terrain" and "pull up" as the runway kept getting closer and closer at an alarming speed. At time 13:43, the Airbus A330 touched down on runway 07 left about 680 meters in on the runway with a speed of 231 knots, almost double the normal touchdown speed. The right main wheel touched down first, but because of the speed it had and the right crosswind, it immediately bounced up again, causing a slight bank to the left. Now the captain knew that there was no room for any bouncing at this speed, so he pushed the nose forward and the aircraft touched down a second time, but due to the high bank and the now downward momentum, the left engine cowling now slammed into the runway, causing sparks to fly behind them. At this point, the ground spoilers finally extended, killing all of the lift from the wings and bringing the full weight of the aircraft down onto the wheels and onto the brakes. The first officer initially called "no spoilers, no reverser green light, no diesel", and that caused the captain to disconnect the auto brake, which was set to low by the way, and apply max manual braking. The reversers were also selected, but only the now damaged engine number 1 reverser actually deployed. The aircraft kept barreling down the runway, transferring an enormous amount of kinetic energy onto its brakes, but eventually it started to slow down, and it finally came to a full stop about 300 meters before the runway end. Immediately after the aircraft had touched down, the fire trucks had entered the runway behind them and started chasing the aircraft down the runway. Now, as the aircraft had come to a complete stop, they approached carefully from each side to try and assess the status of the aircraft and its brakes. Inside of the cockpit, the pilots gave out a short sigh of relief, but they knew that this wasn't over yet. Maybe there was a fire outside on the brakes and the wheels, and there would be a need of an evacuation. The captain made an immediate PA to the passengers, saying that they were evaluating the situation and asking them to please remain seated. The flight crew then proceeded with shutting down the engines and running through the remaining ECAM checklists, which they still had on their screens. The captain now mentioned to the first officer that he was initially keen to go with the safe option of keeping the passengers on board and then disembark them normally. Now, that might come as a surprise to you, but it's actually true. Evacuation is a maneuver which is almost always going to cause passenger injuries, and it's supposed to only be used in case of a directly life-threatening situation. The tower directed the captain to get into contact with the fire leader on frequency 121.9, and whilst he did so, both pilots watched how the brake temperature indicator kept rising towards 1000 degrees centigrade. As a precaution when they saw this, they now started doing the evacuation checklist down to the actual evacuation command, just to have everything prepared in case it would be needed. And it soon would be. The fire leader informed the pilots that he could see smoke and fire coming off the brakes and that they were now spraying water on them to try to cool them down. The captain asked him to confirm that he could actually see fire, and when the fire chief did so, the captain elected to initiate the evacuation, which I completely understand, because it's really hard to foresee how any type of fire might develop. So without any more precise information than that, if you hear fire and smoke, you evacuate. When the captain called the evacuate command, the cabin crew were all prepared and reacted immediately by opening all 8 emergency exits. All slides were deployed except for one in one of the aft doors where the slide had been disarmed after landing by mistake. That door was then closed, rearmed and opened again, which solved the issue. The whole evacuation took 2 minutes and 15 seconds to complete, which is a bit longer than the calculated 90 seconds it should take, and that was most likely due to the fact that several passengers, against the direct instruction of the crew, elected to take their hand luggage with them. The 2 pilots and the in-flight service manager evacuated the aircraft last, after first having walked through the entire aircraft and verified that everyone had exited safely. Out of the 322 passengers and crew on board, 259 evacuated without any issues. 62 received minor injuries like scrapes and bruises, and 1 passenger damaged her ankle so bad that she later had to have surgery. But all in all, this was a fantastic outcome given what had actually happened. After the engines were then examined by the investigators, the SAP particles were quickly found, and the whole fuel system on the associated stands at Juanda Airport were shut down, cleaned and then rechecked before they could be used again. ICAO was asked to create better guidance for the testing of these systems, and the Indonesian authorities were also criticized for their lack in oversight. New fuel filters for the pump trucks were designed to make sure that this type of contamination could never happen again, and Airbus updated their warning systems to associate these type of warnings with possible fuel contamination and then give pilots the suitable guidance they would need. Finally, both pilots were given the Polaris Award for airmanship in 2014 for their outstanding handling of this emergency. Now, if you found this interesting, then you will love these videos as well. Consider supporting the job that I'm doing by joining my Patreon crew, buying some merch, or even send a super thanks. It's all hugely appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.